Hey, welcome everybody. This is episode 5 of the Dollar Bin Bandits. I am Joe Marcel, the bald guy. I'm joined by Orrin Phillips, the tall guy, and we are absolutely positively honored to have a comic book legend on our show so early on in our infancy. We are joined by William Messner-Loebs, writer of just an astounding amount of characters in comics that include Superman, Wonder Woman, Indiana Jones, the Maxx. He's now working for Yeet Comics. Sir, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, you can refer to me as the crippled guy. So maybe not. Maybe not, come to think of it. I don't want to get you into any more trouble than you already are in just having me on the air.
Well, we appreciate it.
Well, this will also is a good way of segueing into letting the people know that when they see this, because they are seeing this, right? They're not.
That's
just
correct. Yes,
yeah.
They will definitely see it.
Yeah, that this is not like some sort of bizarre filter. That there actually is no shoulder over here.
We'll put that in the description.
When I was born, I had a cancerous tumor on my arm the size of a man's fist.
Jeez.
And
Wow.
And that was like 1949, before chemotherapy or radiation or gene splicing or
Right.
pretty much anything. There was just dinosaurs and me. And so they took the arm off, and I learned later that the doctors told my mother that my parents that they should never have another child because it was going to be so hard on them when I died in 2 years.
Oh,
Wow.
jeez.
And it turned out that was not true.
Yeah.
Although my mom said that the reason I didn't have any kids is that my father believed that you should only have one child, and that you should just pour all your resources and attention onto that one child. And and I instantly believed this because my father just was a person who would believe things and just.
That was the truth.
That was it. That was just, and so he had like these little 5-minute stories that he would tell about things. And he was also one of nature's noblemen, but he was, when you say, that's not rocket science. Well, my father was a rocket scientist. He was loaned out from Chrysler to work on the Apollo rockets.
Oh, wow.
If you've ever seen, I can actually do the gesture too. If you've ever seen the first stage of the rocket tumbling back towards Earth.
Yep.
My father designed that camera system.
Oh, wow.
Jeez.
So
That's huge.
And he desperately wanted me to be a scientist or a mathematician or something stable. And I am incapable of doing anything stable. So
how did that lead you into comic books, though?
In an odd way, I had read I'd been reading comics in the same way that everybody in my generation did, but in a more or less casual way. But I had my father wanted me to be a lawyer. And so I got into law school for 6 months or 6 weeks. And it just wasn't happening. On the paper chase, the old professor there says, do you come here with a head full of mush and you leave talking like a lawyer. And I realized that that was absolutely true, that not only all of my professors, but all the guys in the classes who were really, you might call lawyer fans, who had been studying to be lawyers their whole lives, they all talked exactly the same way. And I thought, that's not really a good thing if you want to be a whatever it is I am, a writer. And now, of course, if you've ever kept track of this, and I have over the years, every really successful writer was actually a lawyer first. And so maybe my dad was actually trying to steer me right, but I just couldn't do it. And I was a history major in college, and then I just tried to, and then I went off and homesteaded along the Canadian border with a couple of friends from college. And from there, I had met a couple of people who then suddenly had a comic book company. Okay. As it turned out, they were also quasi-professional criminals. Which is how we were being funded. This seems impossible to think how important this was, but they were funding this through Columbian Gold. I went on a couple of trips into the university to help buy and sell, and then I was the one who was the mule.
Oh wow!
Who was sent? We had rented houses on either end of the street, and so I was the one that was given the marijuana to walk down and sell at the house. Gotcha. Now, as it happens, I've never actually smoked marijuana, and I've actually never been drunk either. It's just I've never had the inclination, but it was an odd situation to be in. That at that point they were just upping the punishments. Gotcha. On the war on drugs, and it did cross my mind it would be ironic that I had never once even gotten high, and I would be in jail for 20 years carrying this stuff around with me.
Well, what were you writing at the time when you weren't doing that for their comic company? What was, some of the stuff you were coming up with? Did it influence you at all with your writing?
Well, it more made me sort of a radical, because this was the age when they were sticking Agent Orange into the marijuana fields to try to kill off a whole generation of potheads. Jeez. And so I was somewhat bitter about that, because you've got friends, and this would just eat away your lungs. So I had come up with all kinds of stories that I would tell myself at night. I was not an ambitious kind of writer. I sent into Playboy. I sent into a ton of magazines, both illustrations and writing, and I papered one of my whole walls with these rejection slips, because I knew that was what you were supposed to do. Right. When I actually had a place to put these stories, I suddenly had this sort of backlog. So most of the stories that ended up in Johnny Quest were old science fiction stories that I had done previously. And
I ask you about Johnny Quest, because it's sort of an iconic character. When you got there, were there parameters put on you to say, hey, stick to what happened in the past? Or were you given free rein, like, hey, this is your character, where is he going to go now?
Yeah, pretty much pretty much Hanna-Barbera was just a charity institution that hired writers off the street and gave them free reign. No, that was not what happened. I had been, when I was, see, everybody else in my generation, you could say, were interested in Johnny Quest at about 13, which is about the age that Johnny Quest was.
Right.
And I was 17, maybe pressing 18. And so a very censorious and judgmental 18. And they were talking about, this was the Hanna-Barbera's publicity all said this was the greatest, most realistic animation ever done. Mm-hmm. I was old enough to remember like Looney Tunes that I had grown up watching, yep. Where you had like the real shadows and, and all of that. And right. So I knew, and the early Popeyes.
I say the Max Fleischer stuff.
Yeah. And so I was very intensely disappointed with the quality of Johnny Quest. And so I hadn't really thought about it until I got hired to write it. And so what I did was I went to all my friends, again, who were, 4 or 5 years younger than I was, and who just loved Johnny Quest with a deep and abiding passion. Mm-hmm. And I said, why do you love it? What do you remember? And so they told me, oh, well, they had all these exotic capitals, and there was this wonderful sexual chemistry between Race Bannon and Jezebel Jade, and there was and they had all these devices, all these futuristic devices on Johnny Quest, and oh yeah, it was wonderful, and so so I got to ask that question for several weeks while I was waiting for my editor to comp together a collection of Johnny Quest stories. She had to. She didn't have something like a collection.
Like an omnibus of stuff, yeah.
Omnibus of stuff. And so yeah. I just, so she was having to methodically and endlessly, poor Diana, do these things one at a time and sent me off all these. So I sat down and I watched them all in an afternoon. And I said, oh, this was why I hated it. Because it was not, it was not bad. And looking back on it, the best part of it was the Doug Wildey storytelling that took place. But the worst part was the actual limited animation. And the fact that far from it being about world capitals and all that, it was all about there would be something, there are mummies on an island, and or aliens or sea creatures on an island, and can you go and look at it? So they would get their plane, which was the one piece of futuristic technology they actually had, and they took off, and then they would go to the island and they would land, and then Dr. Quest would say, Johnny, you and Haji stay here, and we're going to go investigate. And Johnny and Haji would then instantly follow Bandit into the jungle, and they would get captured by the mummies or the aliens or the sea creatures. And then Dr. Quest and Reese would show up and rescue them, and they would show up. They as you will well know, if you have a computer and you fire a gun into it, it sets off all these Star Trek sparks that means that it's all going to blow up. And so they would all run back to the plane would take off, the island would explode, and then they would do it again the next week. Right. And I said, so do I want to adapt what the series was actually about? Mm-hmm. Or do I want to adapt what everybody remembers?
Gotcha.
One of my proudest memories, I was at a comic book store, and the people were talking about Johnny Quest and what I was doing with it at the time. And my mom, who was not doing really well, but she was walking, and she had gone to the back of the store, and she was walking up to the front of the store so she could hear this. And they said, Bill, you've done the best Johnny Quest stories we've ever heard.
That's awesome.
Thank you for saving Johnny Quest. And so my mom got to hear that. And
that's pretty awesome.
So that was pretty awesome. I also got to see this vast sexual chemistry that took place between Race Bannon and Jezebel Jade. And mm-hmm. Jezebel Jade was this, I guess she had about the same racial mixture as although nobody was actually saying it.
Right.
Kamala Harris. Right. You know, she was this East Indian kind of person, and she talked like this because she was a sexy person.
Right.
Oh my God! I'm saying in my mother's living rooms, I'm watching this. She talks like Mae West. I didn't remember this, and but it made sense, of course, because Doug Wildey would have been a kid in the 20s right. when Mae West was the hottest thing in the world. So anyway, that was and I actually did a nod to that. Trying to squeeze in the sexual chemistry, which is actually pretty difficult when you're working for Hanna-Barbera.
I was gonna say, did you ever get flack for that? Were you allowed to go into that a bit, or did they kind of watch that very carefully to make sure, hey, we don't want anything like that?
Well, it comes and goes. I guess we kind of earned their respect over the years.
Right.
2 or 3 years we did that. Part of it was, if you'll remember, there was the first ad campaign that they put out was of Johnny and Bandit in silhouette, looking very threatening. And Johnny was holding a gun, and it said, "Johnny Quest, this is not your father's Johnny Quest anymore."
Right.
And so, this was already out there. This was an ad that they were doing. So I sort of matched my first couple stories to that. I never had Johnny actually shoot a gun, but I had him pick up a gun and toss it to Race or something like that a couple times. And Diana called me up and she said, "Bill, what are you doing?" She said, "And I know you were in the underground comics, but oh my God." And I said, "Well, what?" I said, "The ad. What's going on? And why are they upset?" And she said, "Well, because it's taken this 1.5 years to work its way all the way up to the top floor of Hanna-Barbera."
Oh,
and they blew the windows out when they saw that ad. So she was able to finesse things and to scratch things off the negatives, right, and that kind of thing. And I had like 2 people say "damn," I think, and
okay.
So that got changed to "darn," and
yeah. So
she managed to save us. It was so no, I was not given free rein on this. I decided one episode I had Johnny go into it was Jezebel Jade heard that I think she had sighted Race Bannon going to this small town. And she arrives and she runs into everybody, none of whom recognize her. Mm-hmm. And they're all Johnny and Haji are Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, and they're all playing different characters.
Right.
And she's going, what is going on here? What is, and they're undercover and that sort of thing. But it was over a 2-issue plot arc. And so the person who was actually handling us for Hanna-Barbera said, I have no idea what's going on in this story, but we trust you.
That's awesome.
So that was very nice. I think they all thought I had a stroke or something, but
oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so I had something where Dr. Quest is talking to some military people and being brought up to speed on the plot, and he says, oh, but Race should be here to talk about this. Where is Race? And Johnny says, oh, he and Jezebel Jade went into the library about an hour ago. And he says, oh, well, go and ask him to come in, okay? And he says, and as Johnny reaches the door, he says, an hour ago. Johnny, knock first. So that was about as hot as it gets.
Well, that's pretty big, I would say. I mean, you try to get away with something like that nowadays, and hell breaks loose.
Now, at the end of your run on Johnny Quest, did your feelings towards the character change from when he started? Did you get more attached to him, or it was pretty much the same?
Honestly, it was pretty much the same.
Okay.
I never developed a real fondness
for
those stories. Mm-hmm. But I developed a lot of fondness for Doug Wildey.
Okay.
If only that had been reciprocated.
Gotcha.
I, as you probably know, I wrote a couple of all Bandit issues.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, so now everyone loves Bandit, I see. I said, yeah. He said, we knew we had to give Johnny a pet. So we decided it would be either a Black Panther or maybe a boa constrictor. That would be an interesting thing to animate.
Right.
Something that would be interesting to do.
Right.
And I said, well, yeah. But Joe Barbera went out with an old college chum of his who ran a factory, and he said, so how are things going? He says, I see you got this new you've done all this stuff. You did Tom and Jerry and all the animated stuff. So you're doing well. He says, well, what about you? You run a whole factory. He says, yeah, but I'm in so much trouble. He said, my idiot assistant was supposed to order 10,000 of these toy bulldog toys. And instead he ordered 100,000 of them. And we're never going to get rid of these things. And Joe said, I don't know. I think there's a way. And at that moment, says Doug, Bandit was born. And so that was, so the fact that he says, and now you're making him lovable. We're never going to get rid of him. He said every season we found some way of, I came up with some new way of killing off Bandit so we could have the snake. And Johnny we would have a close-up of Johnny, and there would be a single tear coming out of his eye. Oh, Bandit saved us all. No. Now they all love Bandits.
You ruined everything.
Because of you. And in case nobody knows, but Peavy and the Rocketeer is based on Doug Wilde.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Yeah, he was, Dave Stevens was his assistant.
Oh, cool. I didn't know that.
And, well, that actually didn't get out very much either because Doug did not have a strong sense of humor about being turned into a lovable curmudgeon.
Makes sense. I wanted to jump real quick to ask you about when you worked with Justice Machine, the annual you did that had the Thunder Agents in it. I want to hear your thoughts because here are two teams coming in with a good amount of members in each. How do you write so sort of each member has a voice, but also that the story continues to flow?
Well, it helps if the original characters, when they're designed,
Mm-hmm.
you know, they all have. And I talked to Mike about the Justice Machine and
Mm-hmm.
his. So I kind of knew the characters that he was trying to base these characters on. That, you know, you have the wild sort of Wolverine-ish kind of character and
Right.
the strong guy and the, you know, it's so you kind of know where they're all coming from. And of course I was there when he was developing these characters and he would occasionally ask my advice about things. So I'd had a little bit of input on how they were created. We were just trying to work to make sure that they were far enough apart.
Right.
Because that's the problem that you have. But that was sort of one of the things that I did. When I was doing Johnny Quest, I wrote down Race Bannon, Dr. Quest, Johnny, Haji, Bandit.
Okay.
And so as you would have, like, you know, every panel would have like 2 or 3 characters in it. And so I would remind myself that everybody had to say something about whatever the issue was.
Right.
And so that was sort of the case here. What was the other team?
The Thunder Agents, which was an older book from the 60s too.
Which I loved. What I think about is the Thunder Agents storytelling. When Wallace Wood would do this, he had a way of forcing the storytelling so that you could have like an entire book's worth of action into maybe 8 pages.
Right.
Because those first stories were like, you know, 60 pages, but they were like 8-page stories. And
right. Each character had his own story.
Yeah. And then they would all team up on one.
Right.
And that was, you know, and I always thought that was sort of incredibly cool because, you know, you had some of which you couldn't really use because like No Man was in an android body, but he was also like an 80-year-old scientist.
Right.
And they didn't really use that very much. But, and, you know, an 80-year-old scientist in a fresh and 20-year-old android body.
Yep.
And you'd think you could play around with that a little. Especially since Wood was doing Sally Forth at the same time. And
okay. Now, did he have any input on what you could do with this issue, or was he pretty much removed from Thunder?
I think he was no longer really connected to that.
Okay.
That was, you know, every guy of his generation, every cartoonist of his generation tried to make their own comic book company.
Right.
But until the direct sales market came along, there was no real way of
putting him out there.
of conquering.
That makes sense.
And so that was that. And with Mike pretty much just said, well, do what you can.
Okay.
I mean, Mike and I had been friends by that time for many years, and and I had already written a couple of issues of the Justice Machine.
Justice Machine, yep.
Actually, Mike knew that it was supposed to be an authoritarian planet that they came from, and
right.
He said, well, what should I read to really give me an idea of how authoritarian civilization would work? And I said, well, you should read 1984 by George Orwell,
right.
Which is how it got to be named Jorwell.
Oh, all right.
And so that was my claim to fame.
That's pretty cool, man.
So you mentioned your claim to fame. Was that what got you to DC, or how did you get to DC and writing for just upteen characters? I mean, Wonder Woman, Superman, Impulse, which I've always had a fondness to, Dr. Fate, all those characters. Do they just tell you, okay, Wonder Woman, go do it, or
oh, you're such a sweet, innocent child.
I try. You could write anything you want, right?
Yeah. Well, of course, part of it was I was considered, because Mike Gold had worked for DC, and then he ran the Chicago Con for several years. So I got to know him from that. And then he was hired back by DC to be what they called their Uber editor. I've forgotten what his actual title was, but he was the editor of editors. And so he had this idea that what he wanted to do, a psychological horror comic, as opposed to like goopy, shambling dead comics, This would be psychological horror. And but these things all take a lot longer to put together than you would think. And so he kept coming up with other things for those of us he was talking to. And he knew that, we were all dying on the vine here, because I guess I was being paid about a third or a quarter of what I would for Johnny Quest, because it was a small company. I mean, they weren't being mean about it. But so he knew that this would be a great payday if he could ever get things moving. And so he said to me, well, Bill, what are you, we have a character, the writer of a book that has just quit. And it's a sort of a action-oriented, yet real life and satirical book. And I thought to myself, oh my God, they're going to have me write the new Black Hawk series. And so I had, and he happened to mention this to me just before something like Easter vacation or something. So I had a whole week or so to think about this. And so I actually looked up the history of Black Hawk, and I looked up, because it's always good to have this stuff to do research and have the research at hand. So I did that, and then when I finally, it took like 2 weeks for him to get back to me, because all this stuff always takes longer than you think it's going to, and it always takes longer than he thinks it's going to. And so he said, and he said, so what do you think? He said, well, you never actually told me what the book was going to be. And he said, oh, it's Flash. And I said, it's a real life, realistic, satirical story. He said, "Oh, I said that, didn't I? Well, I guess I was wrong."
It's about a guy that runs really fast.
Yeah. And but I said, sure, because I'm old enough to remember the original DC house ads for Flash, where you just had this red and yellow streak underneath the page, and it says a Jaguar runs at this speed, and a lightning bolt is this fast, and this is and Flash is faster than all of them put together. He was even though I had been reading Superman and Batman, this was really the first book that I was really attached to, and I loved it. So I love this, and Carmen Infantino used to do a little drawing lesson on how to draw the Flash, and I can still repeat to you how you should draw him, because he should be sleek. He shouldn't be bulky. And of course, when I ended the Flash I was going to be doing was Wally West, and he was really bulky, because the conceit that they were working with was he would be like a rock star.
Okay.
He does a lot of bodybuilding and stuff, and of course, I really loved when you're doing a superhero comic, the time you do is not how you defeat the villain. It's how you don't defeat the villain in the first 20 pages. You have to defeat the villain in the last 2 pages. And that's so what and so that was one of the things that I was that I would have to work on. And so when you have something like the fact that this guy has to eat a lot, oh, that's a really good arrow in your bow,
right?
To put off the thing, and he can always be collapsing all the time. And of course, it was really fun when my favorite Flash episode was the one where he and the stewardess have fallen out of the plane, and he's having to eat her peanuts so he can keep moving his feet fast enough to break their fall.
It's genius.
And I had just been talking to a friend of mine who was a big World War II buff, and he was talking about the fact that German scientists would pull Allied aviators out of trees all broken up, and then sort of put them together as a kind of a project,
right?
Because it's really hard to fall out of a plane, and
yeah.
And so the fact that I had for the last 20 or so feet, he just has to let the small branches of the trees break their fall. So that was yes. It was also fun that was one of the stories that when people had heard that I was having trouble, they would write me letters and say that was a story they remembered. So
pretty awesome.
That's very interesting. Now, when you're writing all these, these characters, and clearly my idea of how writers operate in the world of comics is whacked out, but do they at least do they give you parameters as to, okay, we need it to go in this direction and you're going to facilitate that? Or are you given any creative, free reign in that sense?
If your editor is good, and I've had almost always good editors, they know that they've hired you because you are going to naturally want to go in the direction they want the character to go in.
Okay.
That's the fact. We would run into other problems because you've got crossovers, for example. In fact, there was a point at which we went from having one crossover after Crisis on Infinite Earths, and then the next year it was 2 crossovers, and then it was 3 crossovers, and then it was 4 crossovers. Well, at that point, you can't tell your own story. Just completely incoherent.
Right.
And we had all called up. All the writers had called up and said, "We're all going to boycott the next crossover."
Wow.
Because we're not doing our job. We're just having to, have the red sun or whatever the little thing is that you're doing, and it was not any fun anymore.
Right.
And they'd always said, "Well, you don't have to join up," but I always felt like I do. This is part of my job. We should, and it's going to make Flash a more important book in the DC universe if he participates in these crossovers.
Right.
But it was impossible at this point.
Flash has been the facilitator or the linchpin in most of these crossovers. I mean, from Crisis, Flashpoint recently.
He was the one who died.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
He gave gravitas to
Yeah.
Crisis on Infinite Earths.
Right.
Because, theoretically, anything can happen, but anything can happen as long as all of our heroes are still there.
Right.
Be put on lunch boxes. And but Flash drew the short straw.
You make he definitely draw the shortest straw in that sense, but it's comics, so he was back not a few, he was one of the first that I think to really stay dead for a while. And when I started reading comics in the early 90s, which is when Orrin got out, he tapped out. Wally West was the first Flash that I sort of quote unquote got to know. I mean, I read Crisis on Infinite Earths, and obviously I was well aware of Jay Garrick and Barry Allen and the Flash family, but Wally West was my first, and then became familiar with Max Mercury and the whole gang. What is your take on and if you don't, that's totally fine, but what is your take on comics now? Because you mentioned the various numerous crossovers, but nowadays there's it seems like there's always a big event, whether it's a reboot or a crossover, and it seems to be it's wearing thin. I mean, when you had a crossover of a big event, it was a big event. Crisis on Infinite Earths was amazing, and nothing really compared to it. And now I'm only focusing on DC because I'm a DC guy at heart, but both companies are certainly guilty of this. There's always a reboot or something major in the works. So after a while, you're a bit numb to the whole thing. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, first thing I should say is the reason that we didn't strike over the crossovers was that was the year that the Michael Keaton Batman came out.
Oh.
And that brought in such a huge amount of money, because that was the thing. I mean, these big crossover events are addictive for the companies. they bring in the money that they need to function. And so for an entire blessed year, the money came gushing in through the Batman end of DC, and we were all left to our own devices. And so that's one of the reasons that I am so grateful, and I find that such a beloved movie. Plus, it was really the best Batman movie. I do feel that. Not only is it the best Bruce Wayne, and the best Bruce Wayne is really what makes Batman.
I agree.
But also that and it's going. I was going to say that nothing's there. Go ahead. You were asking me about
just your take on comic events nowadays. Are you in the state of the comic world today?
Well, as an ex-comic book writer, I'm not rich enough to be able to buy comics. We all got a complete run of the stories when we were writing,
mm-hmm.
and so you could kind of keep up with things, or as much as you wanted to, without having to buy them, and so I have not bought a comic in years, and I used to go to, when I would go to signings at comic book stores, one of the nice things was that if my wife or I saw a comic, they would usually sell it to us at a steep discount. So it's all about the Benjamins.
No, I understand.
And so and I even was getting getting comp issues from Marvel for a while.
What?
Because they had, they were printing the things, and they were trying to use them,
mm-hmm.
and a lot of people that were just, even slightly outside of mainstream comics could get things, and that's the funny thing, because I was talking to Will Eisner one time, and I asked him, did you ever get any blowback for signing the petition that Jack Kirby should get his artwork back?
Right.
And he said, well, yeah, they cut off all my comics. Now, I wasn't reading any of them,
right,
but still, I wasn't even aware that they knew that I was getting them.
I just like to say, for anyone listening to this, how cool that last sentence was. William Messner-Loebs was discussing with Will Eisner about Jack Kirby getting comics.
Like...
I mean, good night, everybody. And we're, that was pretty cool.
Well, when they had that thing at the San Diego convention, where everybody was on the dais, and we were all discussing if Jack should get his artwork back. Well, I was in the audience for that, and I was in the audience when Gary Groth, who had organized the whole thing, said that that Marvel had just agreed that Jack Kirby should get his artwork back, and so now we didn't have to strike or boycott Marvel or anything, because it was all over. And you could tell that Gary was Gary had put himself way out, and but this was how Jack wanted it to end, and so they did. But listening to the various people who were on that panel, you know, nobody thought that Will had really tried hard enough.
Okay.
And I went to Gary later on. I said, well, you know, he must have tried enough because they cut off his comic books, and they were obviously anything else they could have done to him, they would have. But Will was untouchable at that point, pretty much. And everybody thought that it would be a good idea to have sort of a Corbin effect going on in my Zoom window over here. That's sort of cool. Anyway, it was a bad situation all the way around because people had gotten used to the idea that you had to, because at one point the artwork was worth nothing. And then suddenly it was worth a huge amount of money. And nobody, but if you're in a corporate situation, you can't really just easily step back.
Right.
And so everybody was sort of caught in this. I thought even Jim Shooter, who was kind of in this, you know, he and thought of as being the bad queen in this, was not. He was I think he was caught up in it as much as anybody. And you know, I was at one of these events. They really stopped doing the events where everybody could come to a big party and at these conventions and drink liquor.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. And they had I ran into Jim Shooter at one of those parties, and he said, you know, Bill, I really think that our comics are the best that are being produced. I don't have a lot of envy of anybody else's company. But God, I wish we were publishing Johnny Quest.
Wow.
You're the so that was nice to hear.
That's a big compliment right there.
It was. And
gee whiz.
And Jim is, you know, has remained a good friend.
That's cool.
My one regret about that whole incident is Fantagraphics had printed off a whole bunch of T-shirts about Jack should get his artwork back or something like that.
Right.
And I thought about, as I was going, I thought I should pick up one of those extra large T-shirts and give it to Jim Shooter. And I should have done it. He would have worn it, and you never know. But I was in so many different camps at the time. You never knew exactly if Fantagraphics would take that the wrong way in some way.
Right.
So, as always, I have my regrets.
So I wanted to ask you one last DC question, only because it is. I'm a huge Superman fan. You can see I have a poster back here. Well, the light's blocking it. I have a Superman tattoo. So Death of Superman is what got me into comic books. Not like got me reading them. Up until that point, I was a very casual comic book reader and collector. I would go to Oren's house and our friend's house and flip through their stash and say, hey, what's going on? And then Death of Superman happened, and I would go to our friend Mike's house and start reading his comics, and he would just tell me, like, why don't you just get them too? And I was like, well, you know, like I'm broke and I was a kid at the time, no money. So it wasn't until after that I was like, yeah, whatever, let me just do so. So that is the event that got me into comics and kind of really it got me hooked as a comic book fan and Superman fan. And I just would love to hear your thoughts on that and being involved with that. And it's just cool.
Well, I was actually more deeply involved than I had intended to be, because Mike Carlin was the Superman Uber editor at the time.
Okay.
Before the 4 volumes, and so he wanted. I'm trying to think about how this all worked out, but we were at a little we were living in a little house at the time, and the phone rings and it's Mike Carlin, and Mike Carlin says, well, we're going to have you heard about the death of Superman? And I said, no. I said, well, we got it all sort of worked out. We were going to have our big event. You have to have an event every 6 months or so, especially when you've got, you know, little number at the top of your comic is over 500.
Mm-hmm.
You do something that tells people, oh, this is a good place to jump on. And he said, so we decided it was going to be the wedding of Lewis and Clark, and he said, well, but I got a call from one of the assistant publishers at Warner Brothers, and he said, well, we just heard that you're thinking of doing this, but next quarter on our show, Lois and Clark, we're going to have the wedding of Lois and Clark. So could you push it back a little bit and come up with something new? Well, so he got together the whole staff again, and he says, I don't remember. Everybody said, why don't we kill him? That'll be good, and we can just, you know, everybody knows that you know, you don't stay dead in comics. You know, anybody who's reading Superman is going to know this, but we can do it, and we'll do it a funny way. We'll do it so that we'll keep him dead long enough that people can't pick up previews until the next month to find out how it's going to end. Mm-hmm. So that'll be nice. So he said, and so as a result, we're going to have something called Funeral for a Friend, and then it's going to be the big all Metropolis hero issue. Well, you just created in Superman Sinbad, the little Arab boy. And so we'd like you to write a 10-page story to be in this issue. Would you be interested? And I said, sure, that sounds like fun. So that night, I said, for once, I'm going to get this done early. And so I'm sitting there and I'm typing, and it's not, and his point was, you know, nobody outside of comics is even going to care. And so I'm sitting there, I'm typing, my wife is falling asleep in front of the television, and every 15 minutes they update the news. At that time they did it anyway. And every 15 minutes I'm hearing them say, Special news flash. DC Comics is killing off Superman, and he's going to stay dead.
Wow.
There is, after 50 years, there is no Superman anymore. And another 15 minutes would go by, and they do it again. And they do it again. And I'm thinking, you know, Mike really didn't realize, I think.
How big it would be.
Well, and the reason was that this was just after Clinton got elected.
Okay.
And so there was, and so there was no news.
Mm-hmm.
They'd had all this, you know, it's all ramped up for the election. And now nothing's happening. So Mort Krim, who was the Walter Cronkite of Detroit News, came on with a black armband on his and said, you know, not only has Superman died, but a great journalist also has died. Mm-hmm. Clark Kent, a good friend of mine, has died. And so so it was gigantic. Mm-hmm. And and 2 days later, my friend Mike Carlin was on the Today Show talking about this and lying like a rug, like the gentleman he was, saying, yes, that's right. We've decided that Superman is dead. We're just never going to bring him back.
Because no, everyone dies.
And meanwhile, Mike had called me up and he said, Bill, you have no idea how huge this is. And in fact, the assistant publisher who talked to me originally about this called me up from his European vacation and said, Mike, you remember how we said we didn't want Superman married? We didn't want him dead either. And it's, no, this is, we're not really killing him. You know, everybody in comics knows this is just temporary.
Right.
So he said, but we're going to change it because now we're going to bring him back in stages, and we're going to. Originally, the idea was that, oh well, Superman gets beaten up, and because he's Kryptonian, his heart just beats more softly.
Okay.
And so we're not able to detect it. But that wasn't good enough. So we have to bring a whole, you know, we're gonna turn this into a whole thing. How is your story coming? And I said, well, it's almost done, and which is what I always said, whether it was true or not. And and so that he was so I was sort of on the inside track of all this, and it was very interesting to see it all happen.
Yeah, I was that's still, you know, over the years, like it's been, you know, 30 years now or so since that's happened, and I still, you know, there are certain comics that I will reread over the years, and that is one that I just constantly go back to because there was something about it that really, it just hit all the beats. It just, you got all the emotion, and, you know, I get it. It's a comic book, but, you know, for a comic book to, in my opinion, evoke a certain emotion, you know, from somebody, it's really powerful. So, you know, especially, you know, there's a lot of, you know, memories and fondness to it, you know, friends with this guy and our friends as, you know, as kids and just the time. So it's iconic, and, you know, it's one of those that will stick with me forever. So it's amazing to talk to you about that.
Well, I had a friend who had a friend who had a comic book store in New York, and he said, it was so popular. That issue was so popular that they had to lock the doors.
Wow.
And they opened a window and threw the comics out, and people would throw in the money.
Wow.
They just it was just insane. It was and I mean, you know, this was a time when comics were selling much better than they are now.
Mm-hmm.
And I was selling pretty well with Maxx. But and the way comics were structured, you got one piece. It was like of the cover price, you would get, there was a nickel that would go to the individual creators. So the writer gets one, and the inker gets two, and the penciler gets 2 cents.
Jeez.
Wow.
That's crazy.
I made, from my 8-page story, 10-page story, I made $50,000.
Wow.
I can't imagine what the
Right.
people that were actually doing Superman regularly were getting.
Well, I want to ask you about leading into that, because around that time, you know, you had Todd McFarlane, Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee starting to rumble about Image. Did you hear any of these rumblings at the time? And when you found out about it, what were your initial thoughts about a creator, you know, owned comic company?
Well, that happened pretty frequently.
Okay.
In the history of comics. I mean, as I was saying, that was the Thunder Agents.
Right.
And it always fell apart. And and I always believe what you know the last person tells me. And so what actually happened was that Sam Keith, who I had worked with on Epicurus, had come up with the Maxx, and he was invited in as sort of the second wave.
Right.
And I had heard, just like everybody had heard, that, oh, well, that Image is so last year, and it's all falling apart. And besides, everybody, you know, what we were going to be in was an anthology book called Darker Image. And I'd also been told my whole life that anthology books don't sell. So Sam came to me and asked me to be a part of this. And I said no. I said, I don't want to be involved. Also, the guys they had doing the distribution, I had heard bad things about.
Right.
Friends of mine in Fantagraphics got screwed by them. Okay. And so I said no. And then he came back and he got somebody else to look about writing it.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't work. So he came back to me and he said, can you do this? And I said, no. And then he came back to me again. And I said, oh, I don't know, Sam. Oh, please, Bill, please. We've been friends for so long. So essentially, he had to beg to get me to exceed to do the biggest payout of my entire career. And
I said what was so crazy is that your book, Maxx, like you had Youngblood, you had Wildcats, which were, you know, a lot of splash, a lot of jacked dudes with guns and, you know, splash pages and this and that. And here you guys come in with a pretty dark story with a lot of layers to it. And you're in the same category as these other comics, and your guys stood out so much but it was a hit, and people were drawn to that because it wasn't I don't want to bash these books because I bought them, but a lot of fluff. But the story was, I couldn't tell you the Youngblood story so much, but the Maxx was like, there's a lot going on here, folks.
Ended up on MTV too, I think, right? There was a short-lived show.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. And and I think a lot of it was the fact that you had a whole bunch of 20-year-olds who were making a ton of money. And it became increasingly difficult to meet deadlines.
Right.
I mean, I sound like such an old fart when I say that, but
it's work ethic.
Sam and I really put ourselves out to make every deadline so that our readers would know that it was there. And we did. And I think that did pay off for us too. And I also think that every time something came up, I would say to Sam, so how is this going to match into the rest of the storyline? And he said, oh, well, Bill, I don't want to really tie myself down too much on that. And I said, Sam, you can keep the secret. You can keep the plot a secret from your artist. You can keep the plot a secret from your publisher. You can keep the plot a secret from your editor. You can't keep the plot a secret from your writer.
Yeah.
Which was kind of true. I never really knew how everything was going to fit together. And I'm not absolutely sure that Sam knew. But, I think that gave it a certain amount of looseness, and he was very committed to it. He was very interested in it. The whole thing about Sarah, we had a conversation whether Sarah was in the second Maxx or the first Maxx. And she was this high school girl who was carrying around a gun and in deep despair. Well, so Sam said, I've been talking to all the British guys. And Sam was always talking to somebody. He was very insecure about his bona fides as a writer and as a reader. But he said, one of these guys told me, you should create very charismatic characters and then kill them. Very sympathetic characters and then kill them. And I said, well, and that's why there will always be in England. But, and he said, so that's what I'm going to do. At the very last panel is going to be her putting the gun to her head, and then it goes to black. And I said, well, that's very interesting, Sam. I'll be interested to hear how your new writer writes that.
Right.
And he said, you're my writer. And I said, no, I don't think so. Have you ever heard of The Sorrows of Young Werther?
No.
He said, no. And I said, knowing that this was bad news for him, whenever I go back into the last century, and I said, Goethe, who you probably think is Goethe, like Goethe was this genius level writer, and the first thing he created was The Sorrows of Young Werther, about this suffering young man who ends up killing himself at the end of his novel, and over his lost love. And there were big there were young people killing themselves all over Europe, having read this book.
Oh.
And I said, now I'm no Goethe, and it's pretty arrogant to think that that would happen with our book, but I don't think I can take that chance. And he said, well, but we're supposed to get sympathetic characters and then kill them. And I said, so your new writer will be able to do that.
Yeah.
And so he changed his mind, and it was with a certain amount of pleasure. I noticed that by the time the third season of this came around, that Sarah was actually the heroine of the book.
Right.
It's not when you manage to come up with a really, really good character, you don't always come up with those. And so I do think that, I made the right decision on that.
Would you say working with him that his art matched your words the best of the people you've worked with?
Well, it certainly was, I think, although it sort of depends, because Wendy Peeney, who was a big fan of Johnny Quest, did the second issue of Johnny Quest, and every single panel was just exactly as I had visualized it.
That's awesome.
So that was sort of cool. Okay. But I think overall, what was happening was Sam would call me up, and he would tell me that he would tell me the story over the phone, and then I would say, well, that's good. That's 40 pages of comics you just told me.
Yeah.
Why don't we take half of that good stuff and put it into the next issue?
Mm-hmm.
And so then he would go off and he would pencil it, and then he would ink it very, very quickly on a Xerox, and fax it to me, and then I would write from that. And then by that time he was inking it, and he and I would then send the script and the inked art to our kind of editor, who was also the letterer.
Okay.
And so that was so we were working pretty closely together too. And the fact that I think I was not quite in terms of journey, but I knew that I was never going to have this kind of freedom.
Right.
Even though he was coming up with stories and so forth, but I was still being able to really sculpt the story with the dialogue.
Right. That's pretty cool.
So I wanted to ask you before we let you go, because we've taken up a lot of your time, but one set of comics I've gotten into over the past year or so, I just plowed through reading, was your H.P. Lovecraft material. So Necronomicon, I really dug that. So I've tried to expand my comic horizons over the past couple of years, just trying to go outside my comfort zone and read stuff that I haven't really read before. Now I'm very familiar with H.P. Lovecraft, and but when I caught my eye, so I naturally went through Cthulhu Tales and Necronomicon, and then it wasn't until preparing for our interview with you that I noticed that you wrote that, because I'm really bad with names, so I have to go back and familiarize myself with this. So how did you get involved with that? Because it's so creepy. It really is, and I love horror movies, and for that comic, man, it's creepy.
Well, one of the things I actually was I did back in the day. I was involved in a fanzine, and this was back in the day when fanzines were done on Mimeo.
Okay.
So, if you were going to do illustrations in Mimeo, then you had to do it, very, very just line work.
Mm-hmm.
Do a lot of shading.
Okay.
And everything. And that was so I had started out there. So I was actually in H.P. Lovecraft fandom.
Okay.
Back then, and I loved it. I loved it. And H.P. Lovecraft is, of course, extraordinarily controversial.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't invent anti-Semitism either.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
And he was married to a Jewish woman.
Mm-hmm.
And Sonia Green's response to that was, "But Howard, I'm a Jew."
Right.
And he said, "Well, yeah, but you're one of the good ones." It's like, and if you I've read a lot of hope stories, and if you're going to braid really hard on racism and misogyny and anti-Semitism, you're not going to read anything from the 30s. There are very few people who were doing that.
Well, apparently, people thought highly enough of his work to create an HBO series on it. So, they got over that part of it.
And they were very ambivalent. I listened to interviews with people who were doing Lovecraft Country, and they were very ambivalent about his racism and so forth. But if you're a black guy, how poorly a lot of popular culture handled racial issues. So, and there was a lot of growth in Lovecraft too at the end. I don't know. It's but anyway. So the way I got into this was I almost everything that I've been talking about, Mark Waid was also involved in, one way or another. And so he, for example, Mark does not suffer fools gladly, and was always in trouble. He called me up one time and said, Bill, on my tombstone, it's going to say, does not play well with others. And so when I was in New York one time, he said, I'd like to, now that I'm out of DC, because they fired him out of a cannon. And he said, but everybody has liked the stories that the Christmas themed stories that I did, and would you be interested in doing a journey story as a part of an anthology book I'm going to put together? And I'm thinking, yeah, that sounds good. But after I after I left and I was flying back here, I thought, that's all he has to fall back on? is an anthology story,
Right.
on anthology book of non-mainstream characters.
Mm.
And so I said, you know, which of my books, because I was one of the few people that knew what a good writer he was, because he was editing a lot of my things, and he would edit enough. He could edit so well that you didn't know that he'd had to cut three pages out of your book. And so I called up our mutual editor, Brian Augustin, and I said, you know, if I left Flash, would you give it to Mark? Because I also knew that I was on the verge of working on Wonder Woman. And so would I be able to do everything? And probably not. And so he said, yeah, I can do that. So, because he knew what a good writer Mark was. So as a result of that, that was how I ended up doing, when my whole life fell apart. Then Mark left Impulse and gave it to me.
Okay.
And then he called me up and he said, well, I'm now the editor-in-chief of Boom Comics, and we're doing short stories with H.P. Lovecraft themes and zombie themes. Would you be interested in doing that? And I said, yes, I would. So that's how I ended up working on that. And that was a bunch of my favorite stories. And then he said, you know, well, we're thinking of having you write the Necronomicon. And I'm thinking, do you know that this is a book that could possibly end the human race? I'm not sure. He said, you don't know how it got written. Not
Right.
and so I had a blast doing that. I went back and I read all of, because of course it was all short stories.
Mm-hmm.
So it was pretty easy to go back through, and I was able to do things like Lovecraft ended up with actually a lot of sympathy for the ancient old ones. And he said, you know, that these characters who had lived, you know, nearly forever, you know, were men. They were, you know, they were courageous and thoughtful. And so I managed to work that in, and I managed to work in a lot of the characters from his other stories.
Mm-hmm.
And so and this was another one where you know, I could have gotten a lot of blowback, because all this stuff is pretty much unknown if you're not in H.P. Lovecraft fandom.
Yeah, it's certainly deep cuts in literature in that sense. I mean, unless you're in it, you just don't, you don't get it.
So that was but Mark never said, you know, stop being so obscure. We actually want to sell this book. He just let me go. And
yeah, it's really good. I mean, if you haven't read it, I definitely recommend anyone reading it. There's a certain fondness of it for me because my father was the one who told me about H.P. Lovecraft as a kid, just as a sci-fi fan that he was. And the silliest part about this is my first introduction to it was from a Ghostbusters cartoon show. And I guess I was watching it and it caught his ear. and he asked me what was going on, and I told him, and I was like, oh, this guy's with an octopus head and whatever. And, you know, he goes into the whole thing telling me about it. And then, you know, it wasn't until years later, you know, going through old movies and stuff, I'm like, whoa. And, you know, it just kind of snowballed into like, you know, my love for horror movies, and The Thing being like my favorite horror movie of all time, and seeing the influence in that. So the fact that I'm talking to you about that is pretty damn awesome. So
well, awesome for me too.
Thank you.
And of course, if you want to see Mr. Loebs' work now, Yeet Presents. We'll put a link on the bottom. Journey, you know, with Wolverine McAllister, it's revived in Yeet, so definitely, you know, it's worth signing up to get these books, because you're getting a lot of great stories in them.
And Mark, and yeah, you can. And I'm still looking for my actual copy of the collection, Necronomicon, because I'd actually like to read the whole thing. I only have one issue.
Oh, okay. I get mine digitally, unfortunately. So, like the actual you know, comic book store that used to be by me closed years ago. So I have to venture off to go to the comic book stores or buy them digitally. So, unfortunately, I can't fill up any more space in my house. So.
Yeah, I used to live on a trailer, and I had my collection of comics over there, because that was because I was getting, you know, 24, 25 comics a day, a month,
Yeah.
for years. And I realized that when you walked at that end of the trailer, it would sort of go squeak.
Yeah. Yeah, if I get any more, like, you know, there's that, and then I have another wall on the other side of the room full of, you know, the same. So I got an ultimatum by my wife, so I can't buy anymore. At any rate, I'd like to thank you for taking this time. It's been absolutely fantastic. The fact that we've had a chance to speak to somebody who is so instrumental in all these characters that we've just been so fond of and fans of for years is amazing. So thank you so much for joining us.
Sure. We'd love to have you on again, because we'll both have so many more questions.
Yeah, I know. Once we kind of process all this, we're going to be like, oh, I should have asked about this.
And I'll tell you the story about Mark Waid and Will Eisner.
Yeah.
Again, he just said Mark Waid and Will Eisner together.
Right.
So, all right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We hope we'll be back again next week with some more hijinks and interesting guests. And like and subscribe. And we appreciate your joining us. Thank you, everyone.